Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 9, focusing on Chapter 8, the elementary rhetoric of the pastorals. Welcome to this advanced doctoral and master's seminar on New Testament rhetoric. Today's slide is titled The Lucan Flavor and Stylistic Disjuncture. The text notes, the Lucan flavor of the pastorals. This profoundly means that as we begin our deep dive into the 8th chapter concerning the elementary rhetoric of the pastorals, we immediately encounter a fascinating intersection of linguistics, history, and rhetorical theory. The term Lucan flavor suggests a pervasive and detectable stylistic resonance that aligns these specific epistles more closely with the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles than with the undisputed Pauline letters like Romans or Galatians. In the vast landscape of New Testament scholarship, identifying this flavor is akin to recognizing a distinct dialect or a specific rhetorical fingerprint. It involves examining the unique vocabulary, the syntactical choices, and the overarching narrative strategies deployed within the text. The presence of this Lucan influence has led many world-class scholars to hypothesize that Luke himself may have served as Paul's amanuensis, or trusted secretary, during the composition of these letters, bringing his own highly educated, Hellenistic rhetorical sensibilities into the drafting process. This introduces a profound layer of complexity into our understanding of authorship and rhetorical composition in the ancient Mediterranean world, where the production of texts was often a highly collaborative endeavor. Furthermore, the text states, there is no dispute among NT scholars that the pastoral epistles look and sound different in many ways than the earlier Pauline documents. We can understand this as a foundational premise for all subsequent rhetorical analysis of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. This universal scholarly consensus is not a matter of minor theological quibbles, rather, it is a recognition of a monumental shift in how the Greek language is manipulated to persuade and exhort. When you read the earlier Pauline documents, you are struck by the highly combative, dialectical, and intense diatribes. The sentences are often breathless, the arguments are extended, and the rhetoric is fiercely persuasive, aiming to correct severe theological errors or behavioral deviations within volatile congregations. However, when we transition to the pastoral epistles, the atmosphere changes entirely. The tone becomes more settled, administrative, and deeply pastoral. The vocabulary shifts, introducing dozens of words found nowhere else in the Pauline corpus, many of which reflect a more sophisticated Hellenistic environment. Therefore, as we embark on this seminar, we must constantly hold this stylistic disjuncture in our minds, utilizing our most advanced tools of rhetorical criticism to decode why these profound differences exist and how they shaped the early Christian communities. Moving forward, today's slide is titled Historical Context versus Pure Linguistics. The text notes, what historically, not just linguistically, accounts for the similarity of style between these three epistles and their differences from the earlier Paulines. This profoundly means that we cannot simply rely on word counts, lexical statistics, or syntactical mapping to solve the riddle of the pastoral epistles. While computer-assisted linguistic analysis has definitively proven that these letters share a unique vocabulary distinct from Romans or 1 Corinthians, linguistics alone operates in a vacuum. To act as world-class scholars, we must embed these linguistic anomalies into the rich, dynamic soil of first-century Mediterranean history. Rhetoric is always situational, it is a living response to a specific historical exigency. The questions we must ask are inherently historical. Where was Paul? What stage of his apostolic career had he reached? What specific crises were emerging in Ephesus and Crete that demanded this exact type of communication? By prioritizing the historical reality alongside the linguistic data, we avoid the trap of anachronistic judgments regarding authorship and style. We must reconstruct the sociological and ecclesiological matrix that necessitated this distinct rhetorical posture. Furthermore, the text states, several factors need to be considered, the first being that the pastoral epistles are Paul's only truly personal and indeed private letters. We can understand this as the ultimate paradigm shift in our rhetorical analysis. Up until this point in the Pauline corpus, we have been dealing with public, congregational letters. Romans, Galatians, the Corinthian correspondence, these were public documents intended to be read aloud to diverse assemblies, addressing massive communal fractures. However, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus belong to an entirely different genre. They are intimate, private communications addressed to highly trusted apostolic delegates. When you write a private letter to a beloved coworker, your rhetorical strategy fundamentally changes. You do not need to establish your apostolic authority from scratch, nor do you need to deploy massive defensive arguments to win over a skeptical crowd. The intimacy of the relationship allows for shorthand, shared theological vocabulary, and a more direct, administrative tone. This private nature is the very engine driving the stylistic differences we observe. The rhetoric moves from the public square of congregational debate into the private chamber of apostolic succession and mentorship. Let us explore the next dimension. Today's slide is titled The Absence of Congregational Oral Delivery. The text notes, the pastoral epistles are Paul's only truly personal and indeed private letters. This profoundly means that we must recalibrate our understanding of ancient epistolography when approaching these texts. In the Greco-Roman world, the distinction between a public treatise disguised as a letter and a genuine private correspondence was vast. Paul's relationship with Timothy and Titus was characterized by deep affection, shared hardships, and absolute theological alignment. They were his spiritual sons. Therefore, the rhetoric employed here is the rhetoric of intimacy and delegation. We are reading the internal memos of the early Christian leadership. The letters are imbued with a sense of urgency regarding church order, the appointment of elders, and the preservation of sound doctrine, but they are delivered with the warmth and directness that only a private relationship can sustain. This drastically reduces the need for the elaborate captatio benevolentia, or the securing of goodwill, which typically dominates the opening of public rhetorical speeches. Furthermore, the text states, they are not composed for oral delivery to a congregation. We can understand this as a critical insight into the mechanics of ancient reading and rhetorical composition. In the first-century Mediterranean context, texts were predominantly written to be performed. A letter to the Galatians was not silently read by individuals, it was passionately declaimed by a skilled reader to a gathered assembly, functioning as a surrogate for Paul's physical presence and oratorical performance. Because public letters were meant to be heard by crowds, they were structured with pronounced rhythmic cadences, extensive repetitions, and dramatic rhetorical questions designed to capture and hold a large audience's attention. However, because the pastoral epistles were not drafted for this kind of public, oral delivery, their compositional framework lacks the grand, theatrical architecture of congregational speeches. They are designed to be read, perhaps quietly or in small leadership circles, pondered over, and implemented by the recipient. The absence of the congregational audience strips away the necessity for extended diatribes and theatrical persuasion, replacing them with structured, pragmatic directives suited for church administrators. This shifts our entire analytical framework from public oratory to administrative and personal instruction. Continuing our analysis, today's slide is titled Retaining Rhetorical Devices in Private Correspondence. The text notes, they are not composed for oral delivery to a congregation. This profoundly means, as we have just established, that the performative aspect of these texts is entirely different from the rest of the Pauline corpus. When a document is freed from the constraints of public declamation, the author is liberated from the burden of maintaining congregational attention through sheer oratorical force. In a public setting, if the reader loses the crowd, the persuasive goal fails entirely. Thus, public letters require dramatic tension, vivid imagery, and soaring emotional appeals. But Timothy and Titus were already captive audiences, their loyalty to Paul was unquestioned. They did not need to be entertained or dramatically persuaded, they needed clear, authoritative guidance on how to manage rogue teachers and establish ecclesiastical structures. The lack of a congregational audience explains why we do not see the massive, sweeping theological crescendos found in Romans chapter 8 or 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The rhetorical energy is conserved and redirected toward practical, pastoral management. Furthermore, the text states, and so while they still reflect rhetorical devices of various sorts. We can understand this as a crucial safeguard against assuming these letters are rhetorically flat or uneducated. Just because they are private does not mean they are devoid of sophisticated artistry. In the Greco-Roman world, anyone who possessed the high level of literacy required to dictate or write such letters had inevitably undergone extensive rhetorical training, likely progressing through the progymnasmata, the foundational exercises of ancient rhetoric. Therefore, even in a private memo, an educated mind naturally organizes thoughts using rhetorical devices. We still find metaphors, chiasmus, lists of virtues and vices, and rhythmic phrasing embedded within these texts. Paul, and potentially his amanuensis Luke, could not simply turn off their rhetorical training. The devices are still there, but they are deployed for different ends. They are used to clarify instruction, to make memory retention easier for the delegates, and to provide Timothy and Titus with authoritative, finely crafted statements that they themselves could quote when confronting false teachers. The rhetoric is no longer the main event, it is the highly polished vehicle delivering apostolic policy. Our next point of focus is critical. Today's slide is titled From Extended Arguments to Encouragement. The text notes, and so while they still reflect rhetorical devices of various sorts. This profoundly means that we are tasked with identifying the specific types of rhetorical devices that survive the transition from public to private correspondence. The artistry of the text is recalibrated. Instead of using sweeping allegories or complex midrashic interpretations of the Old Testament to win a hostile debate, the rhetorical devices in the pastorals are utilized to create a sense of solemnity and gravity. We see this in the majestic doxologies that frequently punctuate the text, or the careful, almost poetic structuring of the qualifications for overseers and deacons. These devices serve to elevate the pastoral instructions, transforming them from mere administrative checklists into sacred, apostolic mandates. The rhetorical skill is evident in the precision of the language, the careful balancing of clauses, and the deployment of vivid metaphors regarding shipwrecked faith or gangrenous teaching. The presence of these devices proves that the author is a master communicator who knows exactly how to tailor his linguistic tools to suit the intimacy and the urgency of the moment. Furthermore, the text states, Paul is engaging in encouragement and exhortation rather than offering up extended arguments and proofs. We can understand this as the defining characteristic of the pastoral's macro-rhetoric. In classical rhetorical theory, particularly in forensic or deliberative speeches, the probatio, or the section containing the logical proofs, is the heart of the discourse. You must prove your case using evidence, logic, and extended argumentation. However, Paul completely bypasses this requirement here. He does not need to prove to Timothy that the resurrection is a future physical reality, nor does he need to prove to Titus that justification is by faith. Those theological battles have already been fought and won in their shared history. Instead, the rhetorical energy is poured into encouragement and exhortation. Paul's primary goal is to fortify the resolve of his delegates. He is bolstering their courage to face fierce opposition. Therefore, the language is deeply pastoral, filled with imperatives commanding them to stand firm, to teach sound doctrine, and to fight the good fight. The rhetoric shifts from proving a theological point to mobilizing a theological ally. Let us delve into a fascinating exception within our corpus. Today's slide is titled The Exception of 2 Timothy, Simple Proofs. The text notes, Paul is engaging in encouragement and exhortation rather than offering up extended arguments and proofs. This profoundly means that the standard operating procedure for the pastoral epistles is to rely on shared authority rather than logical persuasion. When you exhort someone, you are calling them to act upon a truth they already possess. When you encourage them, you are providing the emotional and spiritual fuel to sustain that action. This represents a massive shift from the dialectical heavy lifting we see in a letter like Romans, where Paul meticulously constructs an imposing edifice of extended arguments to bring a divided Jewish and Gentile audience onto the same theological page. In the pastorals, the theological foundation is entirely assumed. The absence of extended arguments is not a sign of theological weakness or a lack of intellectual rigor, rather, it is a testament to the success of Paul's previous pedagogical work with his delegates. He does not need to lay the foundation again, he only needs to instruct them on how to build upon it and defend it against encroaching heresies. Furthermore, the text states, though there are simple proofs in 2 Timothy alone. We can understand this as a brilliant nuance in our rhetorical analysis. While 1 Timothy and Titus are overwhelmingly administrative and exhortative, 2 Timothy breaks the mold slightly by incorporating simple proofs. Why does this happen? We must look to the historical exigency. 2 Timothy is widely regarded as Paul's final letter, written from a cold Roman dungeon while facing imminent execution. It belongs to the genre of a farewell discourse or a final testament. In such a solemn and final communication, Paul is not merely managing church affairs, he is securing his legacy and making his final, desperate appeal to Timothy to remain faithful amidst widespread apostasy and abandonment. Because the stakes are ultimately existential, Paul reaches back into his rhetorical toolkit to deploy simple proofs, often citing his own life, his sufferings, and the enduring faithfulness of God as undeniable evidence that Timothy must also endure. These are not the complex theological proofs of his earlier years, but poignant, experiential proofs designed to fortify Timothy's soul for the dark days ahead. Moving to the core of the rhetorical style, today's slide is titled The Parienetic Character of the Arguments. The text notes, these arguments however are brief and largely parienetic in character. This profoundly means that we must formally categorize the predominant rhetorical mode of the pastoral epistles as parienesis. In ancient Greco-Roman moral philosophy and rhetoric, parienetic discourse was a highly recognized and utilized form of communication. It is, essentially, moral exhortation. Unlike deliberative rhetoric, which seeks to persuade an audience to adopt a new course of action or a new belief, parienesis addresses an audience that already knows what is right but needs the motivation, the reminder, and the ethical push to actually execute it. The brevity of the arguments in the pastorals perfectly aligns with this parienetic function. You do not need a 20-page theological treatise to tell a trusted leader to avoid foolish controversies or to pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, and love. You simply deliver the command with apostolic weight. The parienetic character explains the heavy emphasis on household codes, lists of virtues required for leadership, and the repeated commands to maintain sound doctrine, a phrase that itself implies an established, healthy body of teaching that merely needs to be preserved and applied, rather than debated or innovated. Furthermore, the text states, and serve more as reminders rather than full-fledged attempts to convince. We can understand this as the functional mechanism of parienesis. The psychology of ancient rhetorical reminders is fascinating. In a culture deeply reliant on oral tradition and memory, reminding someone of a shared truth was a powerful way to bind a community together and reinforce loyalty. Paul is activating Timothy and Titus's memory banks. When he outlines the qualifications for an elder, he is likely not introducing these concepts for the very first time, he is codifying them, putting them in an authoritative written format so that his delegates can use the document itself as a weapon and a shield against detractors. The letter serves as a physical reminder of Paul's authority. By avoiding full-fledged attempts to convince, the text assumes a posture of unassailable authority. The sheer lack of defensive argumentation signals to anyone listening that the matters at hand are settled law within the Pauline communities. The time for convincing has passed, the time for rigorous enforcement has arrived. Let us continue exploring the dynamics of this relationship. Today's slide is titled Preaching to the Choir, Shared Rhetorical Ground. The text notes, and serve more as reminders rather than full-fledged attempts to convince. This profoundly means, continuing our previous thought, that the rhetorical strategy is entirely dependent on the pre-existing relationship between the sender and the recipient. In the ancient world, letters of recommendation and mandates given to emissaries relied heavily on the established trust between the parties. Paul does not need to convince Timothy that the law is good if used properly, or that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. These are the bedrock realities of their shared lives. The reminders function as a strategic framing device. By articulating these shared truths in a polished, written form, Paul is effectively providing Timothy and Titus with a manual of operations. This manual was not just for their personal edification, it was a tool they could wield publicly. Imagine Titus in Crete, facing unruly and rebellious deceivers. He could literally produce Paul's letter, showing that his actions in appointing elders and silencing false teachers were not his own tyrannical ideas, but the direct, written mandates of the Apostle Paul. The reminder, therefore, empowers the delegate. Furthermore, the text states, since Paul is preaching to the choir. We can understand this idiom as a perfect summary of the rhetorical situation. When you preach to the choir, your goal is not conversion, your goal is mobilization, inspiration, and the reinforcement of identity. The choir already knows the song, they just need the director to set the tempo and call them to sing with conviction. Because Timothy and Titus are the choir, Paul's rhetoric is beautifully streamlined. He strips away the heavy armor of theological defense and speaks with the rapid, urgent cadence of a commanding officer speaking to his trusted lieutenants on the battlefield. This shared rhetorical ground allows Paul to utilize highly condensed theological formulas, that are trustworthy sayings, knowing that his delegates possess the extensive theological training to unpack those condensed formulas and apply them to the chaotic situations in their local assemblies. The lack of friction between the author and the audience is the defining feature that produces this unique, streamlined rhetorical style. We now turn to specific rhetorical forms. Today's slide is titled The Rhetoric of Titus and 1 Timothy, Succinctness. The text notes, in Titus and 1 Timothy the form of argument is more succinct and simple. This profoundly means that when we analyze the structural flow of these two specific letters, we notice a distinct lack of meandering digressions or complex theological rabbit trails. The communication is incredibly linear and focused. Titus and 1 Timothy are quintessential manuals for church order and pastoral administration. Because the exigency in both Ephesus and Crete involves silencing chaotic, speculative false teachers who are upsetting whole households with endless genealogies and myths, Paul's counter-rhetoric must be the exact opposite. It must be grounded, clear, unambiguous, and profoundly succinct. The simplicity of the argument is a deliberate rhetorical weapon against the convoluted, speculative nonsense of the opponents. By speaking plainly and directly, Paul cuts through the theological fog generated by the heretics. This succinctness is highly characteristic of ancient administrative decrees and legal mandates. It leaves no room for creative misinterpretation. When Paul tells Titus exactly what kind of men to appoint as elders, the criteria are listed with bullet-point precision. Furthermore, the text states, taking the form of brief rhetorical syllogisms or enthymemes. We can understand this as a masterclass in ancient logical persuasion adapted for private correspondence. In classical rhetoric, a formal syllogism contains a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. However, in normal speech and letter writing, rhetoricians utilized enthymemes. An enthymeme is an incomplete or truncated syllogism where one of the premises is left unstated because it is already assumed and accepted by the audience. For example, if Paul says, "The law is not laid down for the just but for the lawless," he does not need to build a massive theological argument proving why the just do not need the law. He assumes Timothy already understands the theology of justification and the transforming power of the Spirit. By using enthymemes, Paul makes his arguments incredibly fast and punchy. It flatters the intelligence and theological maturity of his delegates, relying on their internal knowledge to complete the logical circuit. This makes the text highly efficient, packing massive theological weight into very brief, rapid-fire sentences. Let us examine the deeper layers of this rhetorical toolkit. Today's slide is titled Utilizing Paradigms and Syncresis. The text notes, taking the form of brief rhetorical syllogisms or enthymemes, paradigms, rhetorical comparison, or syncresis. This profoundly means that alongside the rapid-fire logic of enthymemes, the author leans heavily on powerful illustrative techniques. In Greco-Roman rhetorical education, students were trained to use paradigms, or historical and personal examples, as a primary method of proof. Since abstract logic can sometimes fail to motivate, providing a flesh-and-blood example is highly persuasive. In the pastorals, Paul repeatedly offers himself as the ultimate paradigm. When he recounts his past as a blasphemer and persecutor who received mercy, he is offering his own life as a living paradigm of the gospel's power to save sinners. He tells Timothy to follow his teaching, conduct, aim in life, faith, patience, and love. By offering himself as the paradigm, Paul provides a concrete, visible model of the abstract virtues he is commanding his delegates to pursue. Alongside paradigms, we see the extensive use of syncresis, which is the formal rhetorical exercise of comparison and contrast. The pastorals are built upon stark dualities. Paul constantly uses syncresis to compare the healthy, life-giving nature of sound doctrine with the diseased, gangrenous nature of the false teachers' myths. He contrasts the virtues of the qualified elder with the vices of the rebellious deceivers. Furthermore, the text states, maxims, and using traditional or sacred materials. We can understand this as the deployment of culturally and theologically authoritative soundbites. Maxims, or short, pithy statements of general truth, were highly prized in antiquity for their memorability and moral weight. In the pastorals, we encounter the famous, trustworthy sayings, which function exactly like classical maxims. They are memorable, highly condensed capsules of Christian truth. By incorporating these maxims, along with early Christian hymns and creeds, the sacred materials, the author anchors his pastoral advice in the bedrock of established Christian worship. He is not inventing new theology, he is weaponizing the traditional, sacred materials of the Church to defend it against internal decay. These materials carry their own inherent authority, requiring no further logical defense. Deepening our understanding of these sources, today's slide is titled The Function of Sacred Materials as Reminders. The text notes, maxims, and using traditional or sacred materials. This profoundly means that the author of the pastoral epistles operates almost like an editor or a curator of early Christian orthodoxy. When we encounter fragments of early hymns, such as the beautiful poetic sequence in 1 Timothy 3 verse 16 regarding Christ being manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, preached among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory, we are witnessing the strategic use of sacred liturgy to settle administrative and theological disputes. Why use a hymn here? In rhetorical theory, quoting an authoritative text or a well-known song instantly elevates the discourse. It moves the argument from the realm of personal opinion into the realm of universal, cosmic truth. By embedding these sacred materials into his letters, Paul is reminding Timothy and Titus that the instructions they are receiving are not merely administrative protocols, they are the practical outworking of the very gospel the Church sings about every week. These traditional materials function as the immovable anchor points in the chaotic seas of Ephesian and Cretan controversies. The false teachers were introducing novelties, strange myths, and endless genealogies. Paul counters this not with his own novelties, but by forcefully recalling the sacred, traditional materials that formed the foundation of their faith. Furthermore, the text states, full formal arguments were not required to remind two of his co-workers what they needed to preach and teach and do. We can understand this as the ultimate summary of the parienetic method in the pastorals. When you quote a sacred hymn to a fellow believer, you do not need to append a philosophical defense of the hymn's lyrics. The shared reverence for the sacred material does the persuasive work for you. Because Timothy and Titus were Paul's trusted co-workers, deeply embedded in the same theological matrix, a simple reminder of their shared sacred traditions was entirely sufficient. The rhetorical strategy is incredibly efficient: identify the problem, quote the established truth, and issue the command to enforce it. The lack of full formal arguments is the clearest indicator of the profound, unshakable trust and theological unity that existed between the apostle and his chosen delegates. As we bring this seminar to a close, today's slide is titled The Testamentary Exception, 2 Timothy. The text notes, full formal arguments were not required to remind two of his co-workers what they needed to preach and teach and do. This profoundly means, as we have exhaustively analyzed, that the overarching rhetorical ecosystem of the pastoral epistles is defined by brevity, shared authority, and parienetic reminders. 1 Timothy and Titus operate brilliantly within this framework, serving as effective, rapid-fire administrative manuals. They are designed to bring order out of chaos, utilizing enthymemes, paradigms, and sacred maxims to equip the apostolic delegates for their daunting tasks. The rhetoric perfectly matches the exigency of ecclesiological organization and the silencing of heretics. The lack of formal, extended argumentation is precisely what makes these documents so powerfully authoritative and uniquely suited for their private, delegatory purpose. However, we must account for variations within this corpus. Furthermore, the text states, it is also possible, since 2 Timothy was composed, and here the text leaves us to complete the historical and rhetorical thought. We can understand this trailing thought as an invitation to recognize the distinct genre of 2 Timothy. While it shares the Lucan flavor and much of the vocabulary of the other pastorals, 2 Timothy was composed under drastically different circumstances. It is essentially Paul's swan song, his final testament before his martyrdom. In ancient literature, the Testament genre carries immense rhetorical weight, characterized by profound pathos, urgent final instructions, and a look toward the eschatological future. Because Paul knows he is facing death and senses that many in Asia have abandoned him, his rhetoric in 2 Timothy shifts from pure administration to a deeply emotional, experiential plea. He is passing the baton of the gospel to Timothy in the shadow of the executioner's sword. This is why, as noted earlier, we see a return to simple proofs in this letter. The stakes are absolute. Paul must prove the worthiness of suffering for the gospel, and he does so by pointing to his own impending martyrdom as the ultimate paradigm of faithfulness. The rhetoric of 2 Timothy is the rhetoric of a dying man ensuring that the flame of the gospel is not extinguished, providing a breathtaking, emotional climax to the rhetorical study of the pastoral epistles. Welcome everyone to our deep dive into the rhetorical landscape of the pastoral epistles. The title of this slide is The Rhetorical Character of Personal Letters in Antiquity. To truly understand the pastorals, we have to grasp how ancient letters functioned within their original historical and cultural context. Let us consider our first quote from the text. Letters, especially personal letters, were surrogates for an oral conversation face to face, and as Demetrius was later to stress, the function of a letter was not merely to continue a conversation and further a relationship but to reveal the author's true self. This is an absolutely critical starting point for our analysis today. When we read a letter like 1 or 2 Timothy, or the letter to Titus, we are not reading a modern email or a dry theological treatise. In the ancient Mediterranean world, a letter was fundamentally a surrogate for a physical, face-to-face conversation. Because travel across the Roman Empire was arduous, dangerous, and incredibly time-consuming, friends and colleagues used letters to bridge the vast physical gaps between them. But more than just passing along news or information, the letter had a profound rhetorical function. The ancient theorist Demetrius noted that the letter was meant to reveal the author's true self, or their character. This concept of character is what ancient rhetoricians call ethos. By writing a letter, the sender intentionally projects their ethos across the miles, establishing a powerful social presence with the recipient as if they were standing right there in the room. This helps us understand why the question of authorship is so hotly debated in modern biblical scholarship. The text states that this is one reason why pseudepigraphical personal letters in antiquity were seen as so violating the very nature of the genre itself and were often so strongly opposed. Because a personal letter was so intimately tied to the authentic character and voice of the sender, forging a letter wasn't just a matter of intellectual property theft, it was a profound violation of the genre's core purpose. It was an act of deception that completely undermined the very trust and intimacy upon which epistolary relationships were built in the ancient world. This brings us to a beautiful example from the great Roman orator Cicero. The text tells us that Cicero, one of the original architects of the rhetorically influenced personal letter, expresses the same thing when he thanks Atticus for news which made him feel as though I was talking with you, and he goes on to add in a letter to Marcus, all of you was revealed to me in your letter. Cicero perfectly captures the magic and the rhetorical intent of the ancient letter. The written word was meant to evoke the spoken word. The ultimate goal was to make the recipient feel as if the sender were right there in the room, speaking directly and intimately to them. The letter made the absent friend present. Therefore, when we read the pastoral epistles, we must read them as dynamic, rhetorically crafted conversations meant to project the powerful, authoritative, yet deeply personal ethos of the Apostle Paul to his trusted delegates, Timothy and Titus. This understanding of epistolary surrogacy sets the stage for all the intricate rhetorical maneuvers we will uncover in these remarkable texts as we proceed through our seminar. Our topic for this next slide is social presence and rhetorical craft in the pastorals. Building on our understanding of letters as personal surrogates, we must also recognize the highly structured nature of these communications. Let us read our first quote. While both of these quotations are revealing, it is also important to bear in mind, as Luke Timothy Johnson says, that Greek style itself in rhetoric and in letters was less a matter of personal expressiveness and more a matter of social presence and rhetorical craft. This insight from Luke Timothy Johnson is absolutely vital. While modern readers often look for raw, unfiltered emotion and spontaneous personal expression in letters, the ancient Greek and Roman approach was entirely different. Even in highly personal correspondence, the author utilized established rhetorical conventions. They were not just pouring their hearts out onto the papyrus, they were carefully crafting a social presence. They were using specific rhetorical tools to achieve specific goals with their audience. The style was calculated, deliberate, and deeply rooted in the educational systems of the day. The way one wrote demonstrated their education, their status, and their awareness of social norms. Moving to our next point, the text notes that rhetorical modifications of standard openings and closings tell us something about the actual nature of the relationship and how such a letter further inscribes that relationship. In the Greco-Roman world, there were very standard, almost boilerplate ways to open and close a letter. You have the sender, the recipient, and a basic health wish. However, the writers of the New Testament, and Paul in particular, rarely stuck to the basic script. They modified these standard formulas to suit their specific theological and pastoral purposes. By altering the greeting, expanding the opening prayer, or shifting the closing benediction, the author was subtly but powerfully redefining the relationship with the recipient. These modifications are not accidental, they are highly intentional rhetorical strategies designed to position the author and the audience in a specific social and spiritual hierarchy. Let us look at how this plays out in the pastorals. The text explains, thus, for instance, Thatcher points out how the Pauline modifications of normal openings and closings in the pastoral have the rhetorical effect of characterizing the author as an authority figure, but one with humility, reinscribing the intense loyalty and personal nature of the relationship between the recipient and the author. When Paul opens his letter to Titus, he calls himself a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. This is a fascinating rhetorical modification. On one hand, he asserts his absolute apostolic authority. He is the boss, the senior leader giving instructions to his delegate. On the other hand, he grounds that authority in humility by calling himself a servant or slave of God. This carefully crafted opening sets the exact right tone for the entire letter. It demands obedience from Timothy and Titus, but it does so within the context of a deeply loyal, shared commitment to the gospel. The rhetorical craft here serves to strengthen the bond between Paul and his co-workers, ensuring that they receive his instructions not as the demands of a tyrant, but as the wise counsel of a humble, yet authoritative, spiritual father. Let us now shift our focus to the specific argumentative strategies, enthymemes and paradigms used in these letters. The pastorals are often mistakenly viewed as disjointed collections of church rules, but a rhetorical reading reveals something entirely different. Our first quote highlights this. Another helpful study that allows us to consider the rhetoric of the pastoral epistles in a general way is the work of L. Donaldson. He maintains that behind all three of these letters is a coherent and consistent argumentative strategy. For a long time, scholars influenced by early form criticism thought the pastoral epistles were just a mishmash of ethical snippets, household codes, and random pieces of advice thrown together without much logical flow. However, when we apply the lens of Greco-Roman rhetoric, a beautiful and complex structure emerges. The author is not rambling, he is executing a highly coordinated strategy of persuasion. He is actively trying to shape the beliefs and behaviors of his delegates, and through them, the congregations they lead. This brings us to the specific tools he uses. The text states, Donaldson argues, in essence, that two rhetorical forms of persuasion are pursued throughout these three letters, 1. Enthymemes, and 2. Inductive and illustrative paradigms. These are the two primary engines driving the arguments in the pastorals. The paradigm is a form of inductive reasoning where the author uses a specific example to prove a general rule. For instance, Paul frequently holds up his own life, his own sufferings, and his own conversion as a paradigm for Timothy and Titus to follow. But the most frequent tool we encounter is the enthymeme. Let us explore what that is. The text explains, enthymemes, as Aristotle pointed out, are miniature syllogisms in which usually one of the elements or argumentative premises is omitted. The idea here is that the briefer syllogism prompts the audience to fill in the gap, remembering what they have been taught before. To understand an enthymeme, you first have to understand a standard logical syllogism, which has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. For example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. An enthymeme is a rhetorically compressed version of this, where one of those three parts is deliberately left out. Why would an author leave out a premise? As Aristotle taught, it is actually more persuasive. If you state the obvious, you insult the audience's intelligence. By leaving out a premise that the audience already knows and agrees with, you force them to actively participate in the logic of the argument. They have to mentally fill in the blank. When the audience supplies the missing piece from their own shared beliefs or prior teaching, they are essentially convincing themselves. It is a brilliant pedagogical and rhetorical strategy, and it is the exact strategy Paul employs repeatedly when giving instructions to his trusted co-workers, Timothy and Titus, who already share his fundamental theological worldview. We turn now to the pedagogical character and progymnasmata. It is essential to place the rhetoric of the pastorals within the educational context of the first-century Greco-Roman world. Our reading begins here. Sometimes it is said about the rhetoric in the pastorals that it is of a more elementary sort than that found in the major Paulines. Scholars have frequently noticed that the grand, sweeping, and complex diatribal arguments we find in Romans or the intricate allegories we find in Galatians are largely absent from 1 Timothy and Titus. Because of this, some have concluded that the author of the pastorals lacked the rhetorical sophistication of the historical Paul. However, this is a misunderstanding of how rhetoric works. A skilled rhetorician adapts their style to the occasion and the audience. Paul does not need to write a massive theological treatise to Timothy, he needs to give him practical, forceful instructions on how to manage a crisis. Therefore, he deliberately chooses rhetorical forms that are direct, memorable, and pedagogical. These forms derive from the foundational stages of ancient education. The text tells us, the list of progymnasmata or elementary school rhetorical exercises was generally the same throughout imperial times and included the following composition exercises: fable, narrative, cria, aphorism, confirmation or refutation, commonplace, eulogy or censure, comparison or syncresis, prosopopia, thesis, and discussion of the law. The progymnasmata were the standardized curriculum used to teach young boys how to speak and write persuasively. Long before a student was allowed to deliver a full-blown judicial defense or a political deliberation, they spent years mastering these basic building blocks. They learned how to craft a pithy saying, known as a cria. They learned how to praise a virtue or censure a vice. They learned how to compare two things side by side, known as syncresis. When we look at the pastoral epistles, we see these exact elementary exercises deployed masterfully. The author is using the very tools of education to educate his delegates and the church. This leads to our final quote for this slide. The pedagogical character and flavor of the pastorals is undeniable, and it needs to be read in the context of Greco-Roman and Hellenized Jewish educational practices. We cannot properly interpret these letters if we ignore the educational matrix from which they emerged. The pastorals are fundamentally teaching documents. Paul is acting as the senior sage, the master teacher, passing down his wisdom to his apprentices. He uses the rhetorical forms of the progymnasmata because they are the most effective vehicles for delivering clear, authoritative, and memorable instruction. The rhetoric may be categorized as elementary in the ancient curriculum, but in the hands of a master like Paul or his amanuensis, it is incredibly potent and perfectly suited to the task of stabilizing a church in turmoil. Our focus now is on the rhetoric of comparison, specifically the ancient technique known as syncresis. This is one of the most powerful tools in the pastoral epistles. Let us read our first excerpt. Comparison and contrast is used effectively as well in these letters, as Paul pits his own and his co-workers' behavior against that of the false teachers and the apostates. In the ancient rhetorical curriculum we just discussed, syncresis was the exercise of placing two things side by side to evaluate their relative worth. Most often, it was a comparison by contrast, designed to make the virtues of one subject shine brighter by placing them against the dark backdrop of another's vices. In the pastorals, the author employs syncresis relentlessly. He constantly juxtaposes the sound, healthy, and life-giving teaching of the apostolic circle with the diseased, myth-driven, and financially motivated teaching of the opponents. By painting the false teachers in the darkest possible terms, calling them liars, deceivers, and people with defiled consciences, Paul elevates the character of the true elders. The contrast is designed to force the audience to make a clear moral choice. You cannot remain neutral when the options are presented so starkly. The text goes on to explain the purpose here. The goal of this instruction is not just to benefit Timothy or Titus, but to help them become paradigms for their audience, as is expected of the leaders they will be appointing in various places. The rhetoric of the pastorals is multi-layered. While Paul is writing directly to his delegates, he knows that these letters will be read aloud in the congregations. He is equipping Timothy and Titus, but he is also using them as living, breathing visual aids for the church. By setting up this stark rhetorical comparison, Paul is telling the congregations, look at Timothy, look at Titus, look at the elders they appoint. See their blameless lives, their sound teaching, their self-control. Now look at the false teachers who are wrecking households for dishonest gain. The syncresis makes the righteous leaders into clear paradigms, or models, for the entire community to emulate. This leads to our final quote on this topic. In fact, we may note that one of the rhetorical functions of the personalia in Titus and 2 Timothy is precisely to present Paul as a model self-sacrificing pastor for his audience to emulate. Often, modern readers gloss over the personal greetings and travel plans at the end of Paul's letters, thinking they are just historical trivia. But in rhetorical analysis, even these details have a profound persuasive function. When Paul talks about his sufferings, his chains, and his impending death, he is engaging in self-exemplification. He is offering himself as the ultimate positive half of the syncresis. He is saying, imitate me, just as I imitate Christ. The personalia transforms the theological instructions into a lived reality, showing the audience exactly what a life entirely devoted to the gospel looks like in stark contrast to the self-serving actions of the false teachers. Let us dig deeper into the nature of enthymemes in deliberative rhetoric. We have seen what an enthymeme is, but now we need to see how it functions within a specific type of speech. We begin with this quote. Aristotle stressed that deliberative rhetoric is both hortatory and dissuasive, focusing on what one ought to do. This certainly aptly characterizes Titus and the other pastorals as well. Ancient rhetoricians divided speeches into three main species: judicial, which looked at the past to determine guilt or innocence; epideictic, which looked at the present to praise or blame; and deliberative, which looked to the future to advise a specific course of action. Deliberative rhetoric is all about persuasion and dissuasion. It tells the audience what is advantageous and what is harmful, urging them to do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing. The pastoral epistles are saturated with this kind of forward-looking, action-oriented rhetoric. Paul is constantly exhorting Timothy and Titus to take bold steps to secure the future of the church. To make these deliberative arguments effective, Paul relies heavily on enthymemes. The text notes, one needs also to bear in mind that maxims were a regular part of deliberative rhetoric. In fact they were a regular part of an enthymeme, serving either as a premise or a conclusion. A maxim or aphorism is a short, universally recognized statement of truth or conventional wisdom. Think of proverbs like "a stitch in time saves 9." In the ancient world, quoting a well-known maxim was a highly effective rhetorical move because it instantly aligned the speaker with the shared values of the audience. When constructing an enthymeme, an orator would often use a culturally accepted maxim as one of the premises. Because everyone already agreed with the maxim, the logic of the argument became practically unassailable. This brings us to a famous, and often misunderstood, example from the book of Titus. The text explains, thus, for instance, when we read in Titus 1 verse 12 all Cretans are liars, a maxim coined by a Cretan no less, we need to see it in the context of the part of the syllogism it is reinforcing. It is not an isolated saying, it is a single proposition which is either a premise or a conclusion that helps the argument. When modern readers encounter the phrase "all Cretans are liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons," they are often shocked by the blatant stereotyping. But we must read this rhetorically. Paul is quoting a famous line from the Cretan poet Epimenides. He is taking a cultural maxim that the Cretans themselves acknowledged and plugging it into his deliberative argument as a major premise. The unstated argument is something like this: you know your own cultural tendency toward deception and laziness, as your own poets have said. False teachers are currently exploiting these exact cultural weaknesses to deceive families for money. Therefore, you must appoint elders who are characterized by absolute truthfulness and self-control to combat this deadly threat. The maxim isn't just an insult, it is a vital structural component of the enthymeme that drives the urgent, deliberative call to action. Moving forward, we explore how Paul goes about synthesizing traditions into persuasive arguments. The author of the Pastorals is a master at taking existing material and weaponizing it for his rhetorical goals. Let us look at the text. Donaldson reminds us that we must distinguish between the sort of traditions and literary materials used in the pastorals, for example household codes, virtue and vice lists, biographical information, and personalia, and the use made of this material in a rhetorical way for specific purposes. It is easy to read the pastoral epistles and feel like you are reading a scrapbook of early Christian traditions. We see lists of virtues required for elders, lists of terrible vices associated with the last days, rules for how households should operate, and snippets of early Christian hymns or creeds, often introduced with the phrase "this is a faithful saying." In the past, scholars assumed that the author simply collected these diverse materials and pasted them together without much thought. But rhetorical analysis demands that we look at how the material is being used. These traditions are not the argument itself, they are the raw materials from which the argument is constructed. The author selects and molds these traditions to serve his overarching deliberative goals. The text continues: it is interesting that nearly all the enthymemes in the pastorals are composed out of these resources, and almost all of them take the form of cause and effect arguments, especially in regard to what leads to or impedes salvation. This is the key to understanding the logic of the pastorals. When Paul deploys a virtue list or a household code, he is not just giving abstract ethical advice. He is building a cause and effect enthymeme. The logic is fiercely pragmatic: if you follow this sound teaching, if you embrace these virtues, it will lead to health, order, and ultimately salvation. Conversely, if you follow the myths of the false teachers, if you embrace their vices, it will lead to the ruin of the household, the discrediting of the gospel, and eschatological condemnation. The traditional materials are woven into these sharp, urgent syllogisms to persuade the audience that their very spiritual lives hang in the balance based on how they behave in the present. This brings us to our final quote for this section. To note but one example of how the rhetorical factor in analyzing these letters has been badly underestimated, Karras points out how the seemingly most artless of the three letters, Titus, in fact displays some considerable rhetorical force and skill. The letter to Titus is incredibly brief and to the point. Because it lacks the soaring theological digressions of Romans, it has often been dismissed as a purely administrative memo devoid of literary art. However, when we analyze how the author interlocks maxims, vice lists, and theological statements to create rapid-fire cause and effect arguments, we realize that Titus is actually a masterpiece of compact, forceful persuasion. The brevity is not a sign of artlessness, it is a sign of intense, focused rhetorical urgency. Now we will look at a concrete example of this technique in action: rhetorical synchresis in Titus 1, Elders versus False Teachers. The first chapter of Titus is a masterclass in drawing battle lines. Our first quote reads, Titus 1 verses 10 to 16 provides us with a good example of both synchresis and enthymeme, which serve as the sort of rhetorical 1-2 punch of Titus and 1 Timothy. When Paul writes to Titus, he is addressing a severe crisis on the island of Crete. False teachers are running rampant, upsetting whole families and teaching things they ought not to teach for the sake of dishonest gain. To combat this, Paul doesn't just offer mild suggestions, he delivers a rhetorical 1-2 punch. He uses syncresis, the stark comparison of opposites, combine with the enthymeme, the compressed logical argument, to utterly demolish the credibility of the opponents while simultaneously building up the authority of the legitimate leaders. Let us see how this contrast works. The text states, a rhetorical comparison or syncresis became especially effective as a means of persuasion, the better one could paint the contrast between that which was to be emulated and that which was to be avoided. As we noted earlier, the ancient rhetoricians taught that if you want to make virtue look incredibly appealing, you have to place it right next to a vivid, horrifying description of vice. In Titus chapter 1, Paul first gives the qualifications for an elder. The elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message. This is the portrait of the ideal, the paradigm to be emulated. But Paul doesn't stop there. He immediately pivots to describe the opponents. The text explains, Paul and Luke are following these rhetorical conventions and therefore the contrasts are drawn sharply and in tandem. The description and actions of the elder who must offer sound teaching are set over against the character and actions of the false teachers who must not make a sound. The contrast is breathtaking. The elder is a faithful house manager, the false teacher is a house wrecker. The elder is blameless, the false teacher has a defiled conscience. The elder is not greedy for gain, the false teacher teaches unscrupulously for money. The elder holds fast to sound tradition, the false teacher embraces Jewish myths and human commands. By drawing these contrasts so sharply and in tandem, Paul forces the audience into a corner. There is no middle ground. You either align yourself with the life-giving truth of the elders, or you align yourself with the toxic, money-grubbing lies of the false teachers. The syncresis is designed to provoke a visceral reaction, generating intense loyalty to the apostolic delegates and absolute revulsion toward those who are tearing the community apart. Let us continue our analysis by unpacking the enthymemes in Titus 2 and 3. While chapter 1 relies heavily on comparison, the subsequent chapters showcase the power of the compressed logical argument. We read, having noted a careful comparison by contrast in Titus 1, when one turns to the second chapter enthymemes come into their own. In Titus chapter 2, Paul provides a series of instructions for different demographic groups within the church, older men, older women, younger men, and slaves. These are classic examples of ancient household codes, adapted for the Christian community. But Paul doesn't just issue commands in a vacuum. He attaches a profound theological why to almost every command, turning ethical instructions into powerful rhetorical enthymemes. The text shows us how to spot them. The enthymematic form of the arguments is easiest to see when they are connected with a purpose clause. Here we have syllogisms with suppressed premises. Younger women should submit themselves to their own husbands, so the word of God will not be discredited by observers. The structure is clear, do action A, so that result B occurs. But what is the missing premise? The unstated assumption that makes the logic work is this: the outside, pagan world is constantly watching the Christian community, judging the validity of the gospel based on the behavior of the believers. If Christians behave in ways that violate the fundamental social order of the Roman world, the society will conclude that the Christian message is dangerous and subversive, and the word of God will be maligned. Therefore, Christians must exhibit exemplary, unimpeachable behavior to protect the reputation of the gospel. This same logic is applied to the slaves. They must be reliable so that they adorn the doctrine of God. The enthymeme relies on the audience's shared, acute awareness of their precarious social position as a minority sect in a hostile empire. Our final quote highlights the depth of this strategy. It will be seen that this last argument in the letter is more approximately like Paul's more detailed arguments in his earlier letters, mixing profound theological and ethical remarks to produce a Christian way of thinking and lifestyle in the audience. In Titus 3, the enthymematic logic reaches a crescendo. Paul commands the believers to submit to rulers and authorities. Why? The explicit premise is because we ourselves were once foolish and disobedient, but God saved us through His mercy and the washing of rebirth. The suppressed premise is that since God has radically transformed our nature through His grace, our outward behavior toward society must completely change to reflect that new reality. This is not just a list of rules, it is a profound synthesis of theology and ethics designed to forge a distinct, resilient Christian identity capable of surviving and thriving in a pagan world. For our final slide, we turn to the advanced macro-rhetoric of 2 Timothy. As we move to Paul's final letter, we see a distinct shift in the rhetorical gears. Let us look at our first excerpt. Unlike Titus and 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, while continuing to offer a few enthymemes, paradigms, and rhetorical comparisons, takes things a step further, developing more full-fledged arguments and following the sort of rhetorical outline we see in Paul's earlier letters. 1 Timothy and Titus are characterized by what we might call a telegraphic style. They are rapid-fire manuals of instruction utilizing the shorter, punchier tools of the progymnasmata. But 2 Timothy is different. It is highly personal, deeply emotional, and structurally much more complex. Here, Paul returns to the grand architectural style of his major epistles like Romans or 1 Corinthians. We can actually trace a classic Greco-Roman speech outline within the letter. It begins with a moving exordium in chapter 1 to establish deep emotional rapport with Timothy. This is followed by a clear propositio, a thesis statement, fan into flame the gift of God, and do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord or of me his prisoner. The text expands on this complexity. The arguments are more fully developed here, beyond just offering enthymemes, paradigms, or comparisons though, these rhetorical devices are not absent, being enfolded into the larger rhetorical design. After the thesis statement, Paul launches into a sustained probatio, a series of proofs or arguments designed to convince Timothy to stand firm. He uses his own suffering as a primary paradigm. He warns of the terrible apostasy coming in the last days. He commands Timothy to hold fast to the sacred scriptures which are God-breathed. All of the micro-rhetorical tools we discussed earlier, the maxims, the comparisons, are gathered up and swept along in the powerful current of this larger, overarching argument. It culminates in a soaring peroratio in chapter 4, where Paul solemnly charges Timothy before God to preach the word, knowing that Paul's own life is being poured out like a drink offering. This leads to our final, poignant conclusion. Forming careful arguments that are presaged by a thesis statement and lead up to a peroration, the rhetoric of 2 Timothy is powerful and involves the ongoing development of a full discourse. Timothy is being galvanized to change his current behavior and get on with using his gifts. This is not just a letter, it is a passing of the baton. The apostolic era is ending. Paul is facing execution in Rome. The survival of the church now depends on the next generation of leaders stepping up. The incredibly powerful, formal rhetoric of 2 Timothy is Paul's desperate, brilliant attempt to galvanize his timid protege, to inject iron into Timothy's spine, and to ensure that the fragile flame of the gospel is carried forward into the dark, uncertain future of the post-apostolic age. The rhetoric, ultimately, is a matter of life and death for the church.